Welcome back to CBS News Primetime. I'm John Dickerson. A New York City grand jury has voted to indict Donald Trump. Vinoo Varghese joins me now. He's a white-collar criminal defense attorney and a former prosecutor. Vinoo, so just start us out again here. What happens after the grand jury indictment? What are the next items in this chronology?
So the first thing to understand is that an indictment is a piece of paper that reflects the vote of the grand jury. Supposedly, it's supposed to be a secret proceeding, but in this case, not so secret. They will file that piece of paper in court. The district attorney will. They control the grand jury. And my understanding is they've already reached out to the Trump camp to arrange a surrender. Then he will be, whatever day that surrender date is, that'll be agreed upon between the parties, between the DA and defense lawyers. Now, that's assuming Trump comes willingly. If he doesn't, then you have extradition issues and Ron DeSantis. Obviously, that can get very interesting from a political perspective and also from a legal perspective. Because if he chooses to fight this and fight extradition, and my understanding he's in Florida right now, the governor of Florida can fight the extradition attempt.
Well,
Vinoo, on that situation.
Sorry, I don't mean to interrupt you, but in fact, the governor of Florida has said, Ron DeSantis has said, Florida will not assist in an extradition request given the questionable circumstances at issue. And then he goes on to make some political points. So he has said that. So I just, picking back up with what you were saying, we don't know whether former President Trump will fight this, but if it gets to an extradition case, that is what DeSantis has said.
Well, let me clarify something. Ron DeSantis can make his statements, but ultimately it'll go through the courts. So if he chooses to fight extradition, there'll be a trial judge who will hear the arguments for or against extradition. Then if the Trump camp is fighting it, then it'll go to an appellate court. And then it'll go to the highest court in Florida. From a legal perspective, there's really no basis to not be extradited if he chooses to fight. For Trump, the smart thing from a legal perspective is to voluntarily surrender. And then that means he shows up at 100 Center Street, a couple of minutes walk from here, and he gets processed. He'll get printed, fingerprinted, and brought to court. Perhaps they'll give him the courtesy of not handcuffing him. I'm not sure, or they will put him in handcuffs. I know he wants to go in handcuffs.
So from a legal perspective, the governor of Florida saying Florida will not assist in the extradition has no meaning in legal context at all.
Correct, because it's a judicial issue. It has to be decided in the courts, and it really is a challenge of, look, he can make things uncomfortable, and he certainly can try to do that. But I don't think, from his political perspective, I would think part of his appeal is to the rule of law, and he should step back and allow the courts to do what they're supposed to do.
Vinoo, I'm going to invite you to speculate and let everybody know that that's what I'm doing. We still don't know what's in this indictment. But in terms of the conversation that goes back and forth between the Manhattan DA's lawyers and the Trump team, give us some sense of how the bargaining takes place in that case. So, for example, I would assume that the DA would want former President Trump in New York to get this thing going as fast as possible. I would assume that then might give some leverage to the Trump legal team. I might have that totally wrong. But what's your understanding or sense of how that commerce starts to take place as they have a conversation?
So this is a unique situation, obviously, as you know, and as you've been talking about. Traditional logic goes out the window here. And I'm not sure if the district attorney in Manhattan really wants to move this forward as fast as they can, as they would normally do in a regular indictment. I mean, normally by the time the indictment's filed, it takes about a month to get to court. That's the approximate time. And so he would then have to be arraigned in what's called in New York, and this is where New York is backward. New York calls its felony trial court Supreme Court. It does not mean it's the highest court in New York. It's just felony trial court. It sits at 100 Center Street. Some of its court rooms are at 110 Center, down the street from 60 Center, where Law and Order filmed themselves the steps, which is really just civil court and also down the street from the federal courts. So it's been my view, and I've spoken about this, that this is not a legally sustainable indictment. You're talking about acts from 2016 that's well past the statute of limitations. I'm trying to think about how creative they can get here. They can say, well, courts were shut down because of COVID, and maybe that'll give them some time to, Governor Cuomo did suspend speedy trial through much of 2020 and 2021, the time, so they can maybe argue that they had some extra time, but really they didn't, because other cases were being brought in the same time period. Or they could say he's in Florida, but they couldn't arrest him, between 2016 and 20. But I don't think any of these arguments are going to be successful. And I ultimately believe, and you were speaking about him earlier in the last sentence, that this action by DA Bragg is in response to the book by Mark Pomerantz and the intense criticism that he took. Pomerantz was on CBS, on 60 Minutes, and on a talking tour, criticizing Bragg for not pursuing the real estate indictment or potential indictment based upon Trump's inflation of his real estate values. So I think that this ultimately is Bragg's way of ensuring that he'll get reelected, which was really in doubt if he did not charge Trump. I think that's part of the problem here.
All right. Vinoo, Varghese, thanks so much for being with us.
My pleasure.
Varghese and Associates.